Critical to the investigation of the crash of Air India Flight 171 is understanding the information contained in the black boxes that were recovered from the wreckage. While the preliminary report provided a narrative summary of what the Air Accident Investigation Board of India considered to be key information in the recordings, and in particular the transitioning of the fuel control switches between run and cutoff, the actual raw data remained proprietary to the investigation, and many outsiders have speculated that additional factors not discussed in the preliminary report were at the root of the accident. In this presentation, I will discuss what information we might expect to find in the black boxes in the context of various scenarios that have been just suggested for what actually happened. In doing so, I will draw on three sources of information. The first source is the National Transportation Safety Board report on an incident that occurred in 2012 when a Boeing 787 conducting taxi tests at a Charleston, South Carolina airport suffered an engine failure. The NTSB case number is DCA12IA114, and the final report docket can be found on the NTSB website. The docket contains two files of interest here: the Flight Data Recorder Specialist's Factual Report describing how the flight data recorder on a 787 works, and a data file containing a dump of 135 parameters out of over 2,000 related to the engines that were recorded by the flight data recorder during the test, many of which are of interest here. The second source is a set of diagrams created by Boeing that provide a high-level view of all the systems on board a 787. The particular source I use is a publicly available website created by a company called Deviation. From time to time, some YouTube videos include screenshots of additional diagrams with more detail, and I have relied on them when relevant. I have also made use of a 6,000 plus page PDF file that I have documenting all the systems on board a Boeing 777 that provide yet more detail in cases where the systems on a 777 and 787 are similar. The black box on a 787 is called the Enhanced Airborne Flight Recorder, EAFR, and it combines the functions of the two traditional black boxes, the Flight Data Recorder and the Cockpit Voice Recorder, in one. Logically, however, it still makes sense to refer to the Flight Data Recorder as being a distinct part of the combined system. The 787 Flight Data Recorder has a component called the Flight Data Acquisition function, which collects data for over 2,000 parameters from various systems on the aircraft and forwards them to the Flight Data Recorder itself, which is what actually stores the information in crash-protected memory. Some parameters, such as the state of the fuel cutoff switches and the state of the fuel valves, have more than one source of information. For example, each thrust lever has two resolver angle encoders giving two independent measures of the lever angle. For these parameters, a second parameter identifies which source is actually being recorded. Other parameters have just a single data source, for example, the flags associated with the thrust control malfunction accommodation system. Each parameter is recorded at regular time intervals, typically once per second, although some parameters are recorded more frequently. The actual time at which a state changes, for example, the flipping of the fuel control switch from run to cutoff, is itself not recorded. Thus, there will always be some ambiguity when constructing a precise timeline of when particular events occur, and it may account for some of the seeming imprecision in the way parts of the preliminary report were written. For any particular parameter, if no new data have been received in the preceding period, the last value is repeated, creating what is called stale data. For parameters with multiple sources of data, stale data are identified by setting the source index to 0. For other parameters, no source index is provided, so stale data need to be identified from an analysis of other aircraft systems and their data paths. The data file containing 135 flight data recorder parameters from the Charleston taxi test covers 2 hours and 6 minutes and contains a whopping 227,833 lines of data, or about 30 lines per second. Each line corresponds to a particular timestamp. Usually, only a few parameters are sampled at each timestamp, but in some cases the number can reach up to a few dozen. Let's look at certain parameters from the data file for Engine 1, the engine that did not fail, during startup and shutdown. For both events, I show the state of the fuel run cutoff switches and the fuel valve status. Digression: there are actually two fuel valves that need to be open for an engine to receive fuel: the spar valve near the main fuel tank in the wing, and the high-pressure shutoff valve inside the engine in the fuel metering unit. I presume that the valve status in the FDR log for the Charleston flight refers to the latter. For engine shutdown, I also show the parameters regarding N2, the rotation speed of the high-pressure turbine shaft, and the electronic engine controller channel in actual control. Note that the sample times of the different parameters are not necessarily synchronized, so there can be a small skew in the times that events are reported. For both engines, it takes about 40 seconds from the time that the fuel control switch is set to run to the time that the fuel valve is opened. That would seem to match the time needed for the high-pressure N2 shaft to spool up. On a 787, this is done by an electric motor, and reach a speed that would support ignition, N2 of about 35%. On shutdown, we see something very curious. The fuel valve appears to close before the fuel switch is set to cutoff. The time difference is a little more than a third of a second. However, nothing is amiss. The fuel valve state is sampled 4 times per second, while the fuel switch is sampled only once per second. More often than not, the fuel valve will appear to close before the switch is thrown, but that is just due to the faster sampling rate of the valve state. We can infer that the fuel switch is actually thrown sometime between 38.094 and 38.344 seconds. Cutoff also causes other parameters to transition as well. Once the fuel valve closed, the source index for engine 1 changed, and 6 seconds after cutoff, the active channel in the electronic engine controller switched from A to B. Various systems on the Air India 171 aircraft have been implicated in theories as to what may have gone wrong. Here I will go through these systems, explain as best I know how they work, and how their operation would show up in the flight data recorder data. I'll start with the fuel control switches. Many people seem to think of the fuel switches as being simple on-off switches, but they're actually considerably more complex. Each fuel switch is of a 4-pole double-throw design, which means that any time the switch is flipped, 8 separate electrical circuits change state. 4 are opened and 4 are closed, where closed means that the circuit is connected to ground. I only have simplified electrical diagrams for the 787, but on a 777, these circuits control 4 latching relays, each of which controls up to 4 additional pairs of circuits, meaning that potentially up to 32 circuits change state when a fuel control switch is flipped. I actually count 17. In the run position, each pole of the fuel control switch supplies power to a coil on one side of a relay, which generates a magnetic field that forces the relay to one state. In the cutoff position, power is removed from the first coil and supplied to a second coil on the other side of the relay, which causes the relay state to flip. On a 787, this circuitry has been simplified, and only two relays are used. One is the fuel control relay, which controls the motors that open or close the spar valve. This valve is operated by electric motors that use 28 volts DC from the aircraft. The other relay is the high-pressure shutoff electronic engine controller relay. This relay sends an enable signal to the high-pressure shutoff valve, and also during cutoff, it also sends reset signals to the 2 channels of the electronic engine controller, changing the state of which controller is in control. The remaining 2 pairs of circuits from the fuel control switch go to opto-isolators in a remote data concentrator, which broadcasts their state on the common data network. Thus, the flight data acquisition function will receive 4 independent indications of the state of each fuel control switch, 2 of which are positive in the run state and 2 of which are positive in the cutoff state. Thus, under normal operations, when the fuel control switch goes from run to cutoff, we expect the run cutoff state sent to the FDAF to change, the high-pressure shutoff valve to close, the spar valve to close, and the electronic engine controller to swap which channel is in control. The longitudinal acceleration should also begin dropping within a second of cutoff. All of these state changes will be recorded in the flight data recorder. Some people have questioned whether the switches were actually moved since there was no camera watching them. However, so many other items change state at the same time that any fault mimicking a fuel switch transition would have been an extraordinary failure. The Full Authority Digital Engine Control, FADEC, of which the electronic engine controller is the main component, provides control of all phases of engine operation, including engine startup and fuel control as commanded by the thrust lever position. The signal carrying the thrust lever resolver angle, TRA, labeled as item 1 in the diagram, goes directly from the thrust control module to the electronic engine controller, as is shown in the figure on the upper left taken from the Boeing 777 manual. The electronic engine controller has 2 compute channels that operate in parallel, of which only one has actual control at any one time. Signals from the fuel control switches, item number 2, go to both the high-pressure shutoff valve and to the electronic engine controller, as explained on the previous slide, although the relay that actually operates these lines is not shown in this simplified diagram. The FADEC is powered by its own permanent magnet generators, item number 3, and uses aircraft power only as a backup and for certain operations, for example engine ignition, that require large amounts of power. Each engine has its own independent FADEC. The electronic engine controller has the ability to shut down an engine if, under certain circumstances, it determines that the engine is malfunctioning in a way that creates a hazardous condition. Attention has been drawn by certain people to the Thrust Control Malfunction Accommodation (TCMA) system within the electronic engine controller that is intended to detect a runaway engine during a rejected takeoff when the pilot has moved the thrust levers to idle. There have been a few instances in the past on both Boeing and Airbus aircraft where the TCMA system actually triggered a dual engine shutdown, but on landing, not during takeoff. Without getting into the details, let us imagine that somehow this system was triggered on takeoff. What would be seen in the flight data recorder? Likely all 4 TCMA parameters, engines 1 and 2 and channels A and B, would indicate true. The fuel valve open signal from the high-pressure shutoff valve would be false on both engines. Both fuel control switches would still be set to run. The spar valves would still be in the open position. The presumption is that the pilots would have realized that the engines had shut down and then cycled the fuel control switches, which is the standard procedure to reset the FADECs and restart the engines. Depending on the reaction time of the pilots, the switches would be transitioned to cutoff within a few seconds of the TCMA commanding shutdown, at which point the spar valves would close and the electronic engine controller controlling channel would switch. The valves would reopen when the switches were transitioned back to the run position. In short, the pattern of flight data recorder parameter values would be noticeably different from those caused by a transition of the fuel control switches alone. A 787 has a number of AC and DC electrical buses that provide a variety of voltages. The main focus for Air India 171 is on the 28-volt DC buses, which power much of the electronic equipment in the electronic equipment bays and also provide power to the spar valve motors and fuel pumps. First, let us review the details of the 28-volt DC buses. There are 4 total: left, right, and 2 center buses called the Captain's Instrument Bus and the First Officer's Instrument Bus, respectively. Cross ties can link together the left and right buses and also the 2 instrument buses, but the left and right buses cannot be cross-tied with either of the instrument buses. A 777 has a similar arrangement. Unique to the 787, however, is how the power is distributed to individual systems. Devices known as SPDUs, secondary power distribution units, are used, and each has 2 sources of power, either the left and captain's instrument bus or the right and first officer's instrument buses. Presumably, if one source goes down, the other source provides all the power needed. There are also additional power units called RPDUs, remote power distribution units, for smaller loads. Multiple people have asserted that an electrical problem was at the root of the dual engine shutdown on Air India 171. The exact mechanisms are varied and not often well explained, change from one telling of the story to the next, and did not always fully account for the electrical layout of the 787. But generally they assert that a short circuit in the aircraft's 28-volt DC supply triggered both engines to shut down. Possible causes of the short include water ingress into the electronic equipment bay, a failure in a diode charging circuit, etc. The short would only be temporary because we know that both engines were relit near the end of the flight. The exact pattern of data in the flight data recorder would depend on details of the failure, but some general guesses can be made. Presumably the voltages on each DC bus were recorded by the flight data recorder, so the shorted buses would show anomalous values. If the electric engine controller triggered the shutdown, the high-pressure shutoff valve would show a closed status, engine N1 and N2 would be continuously decreasing immediately thereafter, and the RAT would deploy. The spar valve would remain open until the fuel control switches were cycled to the cutoff position. The TCMA parameters would remain in the cleared state. In one scenario, the TRA data are sent via the Common Compute System and the Common Data Network, disregarding what is shown in the simplified diagram on the previous page, but these stopped sending data, which triggered the shutdown. In that case, presumably the flight data acquisition function would also stop receiving data, so the flight data recorder would record nothing but stale data, which would be immediately obvious. Another scenario proposes a different mechanism in which the spar valves closed, the fuel control switches lost power, but the electronic engine controller remained unaffected. I note that an incident very similar to that posited by the water ingress theory actually did happen in 2016. Air Canada Flight 361, an Embraer 190 jet, suffered a total loss of electrical power. In that case, the water ingress was in the form of a beverage, for example, a cup of coffee, that was likely left behind in the electronic equipment bay and which spilled onto a TRU, a transformer rectifier unit, causing a short circuit and a fire that, in turn, caused the integrated drive generators to go offline, killing all AC and DC power. Just as in the case of Air India 171, the rat deployed. Just as in the case of the posited water ingress scenario, the liquid evaporated, the short circuit and fire ceased, and the pilots were able to restore power. Unlike the posited scenario, however, both engines kept running. In summary, the flight data recorder contains a wealth of information that should be more than capable of distinguishing among the various scenarios. Here I list parameters that would be of particular interest, with the list on the left taken from the Flight Data Recorder Specialist's report, and the list on the right consisting of categories not in the report, but are presumably present in the Flight Data Recorder's data stream. In the case of the Air India 171 investigation, it can be noted that the data were extracted from the Flight Data Recorder on June 24, 2025, giving the Air Accident Investigation Board about 2 weeks to analyze the data before preparing the preliminary report. Whether that was enough time to digest the data is unknown. The full log would have had of order 560,000 lines, of which 42,000 were relevant to the time between the start of the takeoff roll to the time of the crash. However, nothing like one of the above scenarios was described in the preliminary report. Curious.